Yes, ma'am. Record.
Good morning, everybody. Yes. So, good morning, everybody. And we are very, very honored to be presenting to you this program, this session of two wonderful lectures on Shakespearean memories in Sri Aurobindo. So, we are attempting to bring together, two very important creative writers from the discipline, Shakespeare on the one hand, or Aurobindo on the other. And if we look at the paradigm of, decolonial studies, we are trying to bring into the discourse our own writers and scholars. And it is very important to go back to Aurobindo. Because we find that there are a host of ideas, also controversies that surround this very great figure, and we have two very brilliant people to do justice to the presentation today. So without much ado, I would straight away invite welcome all of you, of course, and invite Shubham Datta, because there are two lectures and we don't want to, run short of time. So Shubham Datta, who is working as researcher on Sri Aurobindo's dramatic poetry at Vishwa Bharati, is also assistant professor at the Department of English, Gokhale Memorial Girls College, Kolkata. He will talk to us on the evolutionary man and state in Sri Aurobindo's The Viziers of Basora. So, Shubham, I would leave the stage to you for your wonderful deliberations. Over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity. And for my part, this is my first presentation on my PhD topic, and I have been working on Sri Aurobindo's drama since 2015. And thanks to
Shubham, we need, excuse me, Shubham, we need you to be just a little louder if you could manage.
Hello, am I audible clearly now?
Yes, you are audible, a little louder, I think. And the audience, you can just type your responses there in the chat box if he's audible to you or not.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Am I
Okay,
clear
okay.
now?
Yes,
Am I
better.
clear? Okay. So thanks to Karim City College, Jamshedpur, for this chance to present my deliberations on Sri Aurobindo's Viziers of Basora. It's a Persian play. And how much time I will get for the presentation?
We believe that you can have 1 hour, Sakit.
1 hour.
1 hour per presentation.
Yes, ma'am. A little less. Please try to wind up, sir, within an hour.
Within 45 minutes, Shubham would be fine.
Okay. 45 minutes will be okay. Fine. Thank you. I'm just going to my presentation straight ahead. Okay. So my presentation is on the state and the individual in Sri Aurobindo's Viziers of Basora. The title of my paper is How the Evolutionary Thought of Sri Aurobindo is Reflected in Viziers of Basora. Very few of us know that Sri Aurobindo was also a dramatist of exceptional merit. Sri Aurobindo is mainly known for his poetry and his epic Shabitri. He is also known for his political writings, Bande Mataram, Indu Prakash, and so on. But parallelly, he was also writing dramatic poetry, which no less deserves our attention. And in his dramatic poetry, he adopts a Shakespearean form and Shakespearean
Sir,
structure.
sorry for interrupting. Your voice is not come clearly, sir. Please.
My voice is not clear.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Is it clear? Please.
A little louder, Shubham.
A little louder. Okay.
Louder.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Sri Aurobindo was also a dramatist of exceptional merit. He was writing dramatic poetry parallelly while doing his political activism. And the plays I have been working on since 2015. There are 5 plays in Sri Aurobindo's entire dramatic career. And one of them is Viziers of Basora, which is located in Persia. Sri Aurobindo writes mainly dramatic romantic poetry. And his dramas are mainly romantic dramas, and where he gives vent to his fantasy in order to construct a cultural imaginary in order to showcase how a cultural imaginary can contribute to the social change, can contribute to the change in the social consciousness. So this is the premise of my argument, that how Sri Aurobindo locates this change of uh, culture, change of social consciousness through visits of Basora. And also, I will try to show how Sri Aurobindo's visits of Basora shares close affinity with Shakespearean's ideas of state. Also, I would like to show how Sri Aurobindo's theories of state have clear resemblance with the more ancient notion of how it adumbrates the philosophy of modern state as our welfare as exemplified with Shubham and Amos question. So these are the four without further ado, I am just going straight to the reading of my paper, and I will just move on to the discussion later on. The idea of state and kingship is integral to Sri Aurobindo's dramatic philosophy. Sri Aurobindo perhaps quite deliberately locates his place within a feudal mooring, considering the ideas of state kingship essential to his evolutionary discourse. The plays of Sri Aurobindo predominantly offer an allegorical representation of the contemporary political scenario. Structurally, they adopt the Renaissance plot device of five-act structure to dramatize conflicts related to tyranny, usurpation, illegitimacy, and so on. Thematically also, they share some discursive affinity with the Shakespearean plays and their famous plot device built around social and ideological problems. Especially in Shakespeare's history plays and tragedy, one finds the manifestations of such problems. The plays of Aurobindo are also analogous in that way. However, it is needless to say that the ideological schema that Aurobindo and Shakespeare adhere to through their plays are not the same. The paper aims to explore the difference between Aurobindonian and the Shakespearean notions of kingship and how they locate themselves within their respective paradigms. It is impossible to read the play exhaustively within the short scope of this paper. Hence, I take Sri Aurobindo's play Viziers of Basora as a representative text to unravel how Sri Aurobindo's idea of state differs from Shakespeare's despite their ostensible similarities. My research question are, firstly, how does Viziers of Basora deal with the idea of internal evolution? Secondly, are the ideas related to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of self-development and the state historically given? Thirdly, how Sri Aurobindo's Sri Aurobindo's ideological departure and how do they conform to the theories of post-colonial alternative. First, I analyze the Shakespearean notion of the state and its historical evolution. The idea of the state in Renaissance politics remains a largely contested one. The new historical and the cultural materialist approaches reread the ideas of Renaissance state, tracing their relationship between the Shakespearean plays. From their studies, it is perceptible that Renaissance takes both shape and are shaped by the contemporary politics, which accords utmost importance to the role of the individual. In this section, I will try to show how the beleaguered relationship that the state and the individual share in Renaissance discourse. It is significant to look at the evolution of the idea of state in Renaissance humanism. The issues it holds up for scrutiny are multiple. Renaissance brings to the foreground the notion of a stable and autonomous human subject. However, the subject was not free from its attendant strictures of Renaissance body politic. Jonathan Dollimore, in his penetrating insight into Renaissance politics, shows how the Renaissance political scenario brings to the foreground the rise of a radically decentered subject. Dollimore contends how the individual becomes the origin and locus of meanings in Renaissance, and how contradictory impulses between individual aspiration and idealism are played out in the world of Renaissance politics. And he shows how the Renaissance tragedy offers an epistemic foreclosure to the actual histories of social existence. To quote from Dollimer, reflected here its religious antecedents, the idealist philosophy, marks of the domain of the spiritual as superior to, and the ultimate counter image of, actual historical social existence. It is not only that the entire counterfeit of transcendence of the hereafter has grown up on the basis of an impoverished life, but the transcendence comes to constitute an ideological mystification of the conditions of impoverishment from which it grew. Impoverishment shifts from being its cause to its necessary condition that requires to pressure one's true spiritual identity into its true transcendent realization. So it's very evident that how in Dollimer's argument, how it comes out that even in Renaissance discourse was built around the binary of the spiritual and the material. How the Renaissance tragedies were offering. Hello? Sorry? Any problem? Should I go on? Hello? According to Dollimer,
Participants are requested to please mute their mics. Our speaker is getting disturbed.
In Dollimer's presentation, in Jonathan Dollimer's presentation, how we get a binary of the material and the spiritual interacting even in the Renaissance tragedy. So Dollimore shows that how the Renaissance tragedy offers a spiritual antidote to the materialist problem that Renaissance humanism had engendered. According to Dollimore, the condition between the presence of a radically decentered subject and the quest for a transcendental subject informs the core of Renaissance drama. Dollimore's critique comes quite incisively from this quest for a transcendental ideas which lacks a definite historical consciousness. What this account of Dollimore foregrounds is the justification and requirement of historical consciousness. In this context, some recent intervention made by Dutta Mojumdar sounds relevant. Her work traces a historical trajectory to show how the intersectional point between the political thoughts of the country, quote unquote, linking theatre and politics to the representation of the problematic figure of usurper in Machiavellian terms, the new prince, unquote. Dutta argues how the dramaturgical shift from the allegorical morality play tradition to later history plays and tragedies, and on the other, it's reflective of a poetic turn in political thought which impelled political writers to conceive of the state and sovereignty as a product of human poiesis independent of transcendental legitimation, unquote. Notably, the medieval idea of kingship was marked by a sacrosanct character of sovereign authority. This relates intrinsically to the divine nature of kingship in the medieval era. As J.H. Burns argues, what leads to the early departure from the medieval theory of kingship is the intimation of the divine rights with hereditary succession. J.M. Phillips, another important Renaissance historian, shows how the idea of succession through primogeniture comes to the political scenario in the mid-15th century. The entanglement of the two, the divine rights of the kingship on the one hand and the laws of primogeniture on the other, leads to a political conflict that remains a major bone of contention in Renaissance poetic and dramatic philosophy. Majumdar argues how this crisis leads to the emergence of a tyrant as a figure who poses threat to the ethics of legitimacy through tyranny and unlawful transgression. Alongside this, it is interesting to observe the presence of a legal discourse that frames the idea of kingship in Elizabethan England. It is reflected in Buchanan's idea of resistance, where he debunks the divinely empowered notion of kingship and foregrounds the role of people in administering resistance against royal supremacy. He brings in the question of rights of populace in the matters of the state. His perception shows how the notion of kingship was based on a human contract of poesis. He argues, we, however, to quote from Buchanan, we, however, maintain the people from whom our kings derive whatever rights they claim are more powerful than kings, and that the populace at large has the same rights over them as they have over individuals in the populace, unquote. Buchanan's reading of state in light of contractual negotiation between two parties not merely secularizes the idea of kingship, but also makes the body of the king amenable to critical scrutiny. Ernst Kantorowicz' idea of the king's two bodies comes as an intervention along this line. Within a secularist premise, Kantorowicz, in his book, argues how the notion of kingship in Elizabethan England conceptualizes the king both biologically and biopolitically. Kantowicz's discussion draws on the reports by Plowden to show the two bodies constitute on unit, to quote from Kantorowicz, on unit indivisible, each being fully content in the other, a unity that could be dissolved only with the demise of the natural body of the monarch, unquote. So Kantorowicz shows how there is an inextricable unity between the body of the king and the body politic. So this interplay is also a significant intervention in the idea of Renaissance state. This notion of indivisible kingship remains integral to Renaissance statecraft, making the personal invariably political, leading to the problems of negotiation and adjustment. Thereby, the 16th century idea of state witnesses a transition from the divine theology of kingship towards a conceptualization of the state as an inclusive boundary where the personal and the political remain bound in the matter of unity and tension. The emergence of Shakespeare can be located in this context, where the changing trajectory of the plays plays a pivotal role. Historically, Shakespeare arrives at the crossroads of Tudor and Jacobean dynasties. The transition between the two periods gets reflected in Shakespeare's dramatic narrative and the changing political structures they embody. About stagecraft, what fundamentally shapes the moments of crisis in Shakespearean plays is an overlap between the personal and the political, leading to an irreconcilable conflict between the king's two bodies. For example, in plays like Macbeth and Hamlet, the assertion of radical subjectivity goes at variance with the biopolitical duty of the king as the functional head of the state. The conflict between the divine right of kingship and the issue of succession often ruptures the feudal order. The monarch's ethical degeneration into tyranny and usurpation entails the problem of structural balance in the political state, leading it into anarchy, chaos, and disarray. Robin Hadlam Wells, in his study of Shakespeare and Renaissance politics, shows how from the 1530s onwards, a small but steady stream of dissident writers had reasserted the medieval belief in the rights of subjects to rebel against the unjust authority. By the 1590s, when the threat of invasion from Catholic Europe had largely been averted, moderate opinion became increasingly skeptical of the idea so forcibly expressed by Shakespeare's Richard II that the kings are sacrosanct, unquote. Apart from this, there was a converse trend operational in the Renaissance Europe. This trend also identified itself with a quest for a stable political.
Shubham, louder, louder,
Hello.
a bit louder.
Okay.
Shubham sir, I think there is some problem with your earphone. If you can please remove your headphone and talk directly
Okay.
with the
Okay.
laptop, with the speaker
Okay.
of your laptop.
Okay. Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes, sir.
better, better.
Better.
Okay. Okay. So there was some problem with my earphone, perhaps. Okay. So apart from this, there was a converse trend operational in the Renaissance Europe. This trend also identified itself with a quest for a stable political system. This leads to the popularization of the idea of mixed constitution with the amalgamation of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. The role of Niccolo Machiavelli, the role that Niccolo Machiavelli plays in this context marks a departure to salvage the individual rights and agency from the overarching ethical and political restriction surrounding the notion of Renaissance kingship. Machiavelli's The Prince shows ways of bypassing the ethical compulsion to pursue their interest, to formulate methods of real politics. Taking a cue from Machiavelli's idea of a ruler, which offers a paradigm shift in the notion of kingship, recent Shakespearean criticism often focuses on the presence of a monarchical republic, as Andrew Hartfield has shown us, accumulating different political institutions. Hartfield concludes that Shakespeare became the most, to quote from Hartfield, Shakespeare became the most important, Shakespeare became the most prominent of a number of English Renaissance writers who wished to explore similar issues in their writing, unquote. From the above discussion, one can see how the relationship between the state and individual was a site of multiple contestation and negotiation in Shakespeare and its Renaissance politics. Owing to the lack of scope, we could not read any of the Shakespearean plays in detail here to unravel how the relationship between state and the individual informs its thematic core. However, that this problematic remains true or remains intrinsic to the plays like Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, Henry V, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and others. This duality between the symbolic and semiotic, the real and the ideal, the illegitimate and the lawful, the ethical commitment and the quest for transcendence makes the Renaissance individual paradoxically radical and reactionary at the same time. Now I will come to Sri Aurobindo. This was the basic backdrop of my paper, that I tried to locate the idea of Renaissance politics. I tried to locate the discourse within which Shakespeare formulates his dramatic ideas. Now let's come to Sri Aurobindo and let's look at how Sri Aurobindo follows the Shakespearean paradigm in his plays, but departs from it. And for Sri Aurobindo, I will draw on the text Viziers of Basora. The historical context of Sri Aurobindo also remains a mingled one. For Sri Aurobindo, the sense of mingling does not remain constricted to a uniform monolithic category. Rather, it opens up an interdiscursive space of dialogue, negotiation, and intersectionality. The first point that this paper seeks to stress is how this intersectionality remains predominant in the cultural location of Aurobindo. And I have tried to show how his Anglophile father had a very distinctive ambivalent influence on his life. Secondly, the point that I will try to trace here is the way Sri Aurobindo's affinity towards an inclusive idea of the self and the evolutionary thought shapes the idea of an imagined community, to quote from Benedict Anderson. It is important, before we begin, it is important to regard Sri Aurobindo's ideas of nationalism. As Sri Aurobindo shows in the foundation of Indian culture, to quote from Aurobindo, Each nation is a Shakti or power of the evolving spirit in humanity and lives by the principle which it embodies. India is the Bharata Shakti, the living energy of a great spiritual conception, and fidelity to it is the very principle its of her existence. For by its virtue alone, she has been one of the immortal nations. This alone has been the secret of her amazing persistence and perpetual force of customizes, of survival and revival. So, what is intrinsic to Sri Aurobindo's idea of the nation is its conceptualization as a Shakti, as a power, as an inherent spiritual power. So, this is how Sri Aurobindo marks a departure from Shakespeare in the very first place. Whereas Shakespeare depends entirely on the externality of the political action and offers a spiritual antidote for the salvation of the for the salvation or the redemption of the individual. Sri Aurobindo, on the other hand, depends or premises his ideas on the inner Shakti of man, inner Shakti of nation, inner Shakti of spiritual self development. So, this binary between the inner and the outer, the external and the internal, remains quite intrinsic to the ideas of Sri Aurobindo, although he draws largely on Shakespearean ideas in his dramatic philosophy. This leads to the redefinition of Aurobindo's conceptualization of nationalism as divine entity or godhead, which is imperissibly omnipresent. The idea of conceiving the nation at the juncture of consciousness, mingling politics and spirituality, seems to set apart Sri Aurobindo from his contemporary thinkers in unique ways. From the schematic structure of Sri Aurobindo's plays, one might unmistakably draw semblance between Sri Aurobindo and Shakespeare. However, their resemblance is not entirely unjust, as Sri Aurobindo admittedly was deeply influenced by not merely Shakespeare but also the other Renaissance dramatists. Hence, in the plays The Feudal Order, he portrays looks quite analogous to Shakespearean dramas. However, the tradition of thought that Sri Aurobindo represents is quite different from the Western tradition and its conceptualization of man in general. The fundamental departure of Sri Aurobindo lies in the unraveling of the inner being of man or the psychic being of man, which often oddly chimes with the outward manifestation of power and the glory. His evolutionary philosophy focuses on the immanent presence of a divine nucleus or a psychic being inside an individual, which leads to its inner perfection. The relationship the individual shares with the environment is organic, which leads to the co-evolution, which leads to the co-evolution of man and society in general. Sorry, just I need 1 minute break. Oh, I need some water. Thank you. Sri Aurobindo's ideas on state remain embedded in a different discursive tradition of Hindu poetics, despite having some obvious similarities with the Elizabethan structure of the state. Hence, before delving deeper into Sri Aurobindo, it is important to know the Hindu theories of the state and that had a direct impact on Sri Aurobindo. By mentioning Hindu, I don't want to contextualize Sri Aurobindo within a strict ontological or exclusive parochial Hindu paradigm. For Sri Aurobindo, the idea of Hinduism or the idea of Hindu theory of state becomes an inclusive category where different religions, different ideologies, different notions, different sensibilities come together. So for Aurobindo, Hindu does not mean Hindutva, the sense we use it in our contemporary, in our present sense. Rather, Sri Aurobindo advocates the idea of a grand narrative of Hinduism where different ideologies, divergent ideologies conflict, and that is why uh, uh, using Persia as the setting of his viziers of Basora and shows how the internal evolution is happening within the characters in Persia. Within the characters within the characters of the play. Before we go into the play, it's relevant to know the idea of state within which I will try to locate the play. Vinay Kumar Sharkar, in an incisive article, shows that the idea of state and non-state was intrinsic to Hindu political theory. Sharkar comments to quote from Sharkar, two inseparable accidents of the Hindu theory of the state are first, the doctrine of mamta or svata, one's ownness, proprium or propriety. Secondly, the doctrine of dharma, i.e., that means law, justice, and duty. And behind them both lies the doctrine of dando, punishment, restraint, and sanction. Herein is to be short the nucleus of the whole Hindu philosophy of sovereignty. A state is a state because it can coerce, restrain, and compel, eliminate control of the coercive element from social life, and the state as an entity vanishes. Dondo is one of the primary essence of state relation. No dondo, no state. A dondo is less, sanctionless, state is a contraction in terms. From Sharkar's idea, it can be understood how the Hindu state was built around that of crime and punishment. This again, I refer the Hindu state is actually he is referring to the ancient Vedic politics, ancient Vedic ideas of kingship by mentioning the Hindu ideas of state. So this idea of Hindu state does not in any way resemble the contemporary sense of impostor in which we use it. That of crime and punishment quite like the Renaissance ethical position of the state. V.P. Burma, Vishwanath Prasad Burma, one of the seminal critics of Sri Aurobindo, in his study explores how the inbuilt spiritual nature of man corresponds to the divinity of kingship in the ancient Hindu philosophical thought. What is interesting and unique about the Hindu philosophical tradition is an emphasis on the laws of dharma as the governing principle of individual action. The presence of an a priori moral sense was prerequisite for the state to thrive. However, this a priori ethical code was neither socially nor religiously determined. It accorded importance to the intuitive intellect and an awareness of the inner being that could take the state forward with its gradual actualization. The way Sri Aurobindo through his plays departs from and conforms to this dual traditions he remains embedded is interesting to look at. Viziers of Basora is one of the early plays of Sri Aurobindo, whereas Pursues the Deliverer, one of his other plays, predominantly articulates Sri Aurobindo's sentiment for emancipation from an oppressively tyrannical force with an allegorical subtext. Viziers perhaps remains the most overtly political text of his dramatic repertoire. It reveals the dramatist's acute sense of ethical justice. The play unfolds in an Islamic universe of Basora, filled with passion, exuberances, machinations, despotism, intrigues, and laughs. The characters in Viziers are closer to life. They remain entranced in a feudal mirroring with a set of conditions and attributes. In this play as well, the evolutionary philosophy of Sri Aurobindo plays a role in mediating the relationship between contrary ideas, sensibilities, and consciousness. Visions of Basora is different from Perseus in many ways. Perseus the Deliverer is one of the plays by Sri Aurobindo. It was one of his earliest plays. And in Perseus the Deliverer, he shows how Perseus acts like Prometheus and contributes to the salvation or redemption of humanity from the stranglehold of Poseidon, of sea god Poseidon. So, allegorically, what he seeks to explores, I perceive, is the inner revolutionary spirit of man and how it contributes to the change in the consciousness, change in the political and the social consciousness by inaugurating a new philosophy of life. So it is understandable that when Sri Aurobindo was writing Perseus, he was part of the intense political activism for Indian national struggle, Indian national freedom struggle. And this revolutionary idea uh, very quite pertinently resonates with his idea of freedom struggle in the play. In Pursuit, the dramatist deliberately recreates a Greek myth in a Syrian world of the historicity of the location. Also one of the earlier plays of Sri Aurobindo, but here he delves deeper into the politics of statecraft. In Vizies, he quite uh, his ideas with the hierarchically laden Islamic world of viziers, caliphs, and slave girls, retaining its cultural specificity. One might question the veracity of such representations, as Aurobindo derives much from the Oriental stereotypes about the Ottoman Empire to convey his ideas through the play. Sri Aurobindo's familiarity with the image of the Middle East was understandably an outcome of his readings of the Romantic classics. His imagination of Syria is identical to Shelley's portrayal of the Ottoman Empire in the Revolt of Islam. However, I think his ostensible conformity to the Western stereotypes was essentially a means of breaking them. My aim in this section is to show how this play crucially amalgamates the ethics and politics to establish Sri Aurobindo's vision of justice. In the ethical framework of Sri Aurobindo, traits like submission, loyalty, and acute sense of self-righteousness coexist. Coexist. Uh, Sorry. Before before we continue, is there any problem?
No,
Hello.
no issues.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, Shubham, please continue.
Okay. Thank you. Uh, 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 Okay, as Shudipto Kobiraj, one of the critics of one of the seminal critics or one of the seminal thinkers on the development of Indian state, argues that in terms of the historical long term, the entry of Islam into Indian society triggered highly significant changes in many other fields of social life, but not in the structure of its political order. So, what is relevant here is from Sudipta Kobir's argument that the arrival of Islam, although created rupture in many ways of Indian life, the previous ways of Indian life, but the political order remains the same. The Islamic State saw itself as a limited and socially distant as the Hindu state. Crucially, because of this, neither the Hindu nor the Islamic State employed a conception of what domination entailed that was strictly similar to European notions of sovereignty. So, from Kabir's argument, how he shows that Hindu and the ideas of Hindu state and the Islamic state share a close affinity, and how it departs from or how to depart from the European notions of sovereignty. In terms of their external relations with other kingdoms or empires, the states were certainly sovereign over their territories, but we cannot simply assume that in their internal relation with subjects, with states, exercise the familiar rights of sovereignty. So, from Kabir's argument, it's understandable, it's evident that how a notion of interiority or the inner development was integral part of both Hindu and the Muslim ideas or Islam ideas of self-fashioning Islam ideas of state. It is implicitly invoked in every demand for justice, equality, dignity, and assistance. Because all such demands can be made only in its name and in the state's responsibility to meet all these expectations. Ordinary Indians see the operation of the state in many tangible ways, many tangible events, which couldn't have happened without it. The poor, for whom this state should have been the most difficult to discern, see the presence in the way the right to property is put in abeyance when they squat on the government land or imposed on the private property. The idea from Korea's argument, what is perceptible is that the idea of state in India has gone through an astonishing transformation. It has cut itself loose from the attachment of the conceptions of the nation, but has attained a strange apotheosis as the only repository, though elusively present, of people's moral aspirations. So the people's moral aspirations, ethical aspirations, are intrinsically related to the both Hindu and Hindu political order and the Islamic political order. In Disease of Basora, Sri Aurobindo draws an analogy between the Hindu political order and the Islamic political order in order to advocate his ideas of evolution, justice, and equality. In Disease of Basora, the playwright explores a politically fraught world of Basora, where the crisis prevails through a series of antinomies: morality, immorality, transgression, illusory idealism, practical approach to life, real and mistaken tropes of identity, to mention some of them. Owing to this, the question of justice, inheritance, laws, and governance permeate the play. The title refers to the central characters, the two viziers of Basora, who act as foils, while Al-Fazl Ibn Sani, the good vizier, is governed by an ethical consciousness which steadfast loyalty not only to the feudal bond he serves, but also to the religious edicts of Islam. Al-Mu'min, the other vizier, is deceitful and cunning. In the moral universe of Sri Aurobindo, despite the presence of treachery, imperfections, cunning, deceit, and intrigues, justice always prevails in the end. Here, in the play as well, the ruptures in the political order are restored by Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the divinely appointed agent. From the outset, the political problem of Basora gets perceptible through the exchange between Murad and Sundar. The premise that Sri Aurobindo adopts in this play is Shakespearean. It does not merely follow an Elizabethan structural form, but it also uses the trope of feudal disloyalty intrinsic to Renaissance drama. The premise is on the comparison between two viziers of Basora, one made in the god's image and a British amalgam of guerrilla and Beberian, through Murad, a Turk of captain of police in Basora, and Sundar, a chamberlain of the palace of Basora. Along with this, Sri Aurobindo draws a parallelism between their sons as well. While Nuruddin, the son of Al-Fazl, is illusory, romantic, and prodigal, Farid, the son of Al-Mu'min, is corrupt, lustful, and violent. This comparative analogy drawn between their sons becomes symptomatic of Sri Aurobindo's views on hereditary influence, how they get transmuted into the posterity through a process of internal development. It is interesting how the security officials express their disgruntlement with the conditions of Basora. Unlike Perseus, no prologue is used in Viziers of Basora. The king remains complicit to the action of Al-Mu'min, both overtly and covertly. It goes against the fundamental tenets of feudalism. Due to this, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid intervenes to resolve the problems of Basora and thereby redresses the political order. The central conflict of the play stems from the purchase of a slave girl, Anis al-Jais. Anis recurrently falls prey to multiple male gazes, be it Farid, Nuruddin, even Sunny himself. She is an embodiment of physical beauty, dress, and rich cultural heritage. How Anne's body is bickered over at the harem speaks volumes about the crude dehumanization of women in Basora. Even in Ibn Sani's comment about Alice is not free from patriarchal prejudices against a woman's intellectual temper. Swanee purchases her from the market for the king, and is with her oratorial finesse and extreme physical beauty immediately gets into the snares of other members of the family. The play takes a turn when Anis and Nuruddin fall in love while remaining in the household of Ibn Sani. Dunya, the niece of Ibn Sani, plays an instrumental role behind the union. Ibn Sani fails to stave off the union of Anis and Nuruddin despite his initial misgivings. In the eventual turn to redeem Nuruddin of his wasteful and excessively romantic nature, Ibn imposes a greater responsibility on Nuruddin and becomes to wrong. Nuruddin, due to his prodigal behavior, soon charges all the wealth. The state exchequer runs into wretchedness due to their profligacy. If even Ibn Sana's inertia lies in the overindulgence to his son and the lack of proper awareness of Nuruddin and his possible love affairs, the central problem of Nuruddin's character lies in his failure to straddle between his illusory ideals and the practical necessity. Al-Mu'min takes advantage of this vulnerability in Nuruddin's character. Crafty Al-Mu'min misrepresents the image of Nuruddin to the king and thereby ensnares both Nuruddin and Enis. Finally, Harun al-Rashid comes to their succor and averts their tragedy. The play Riches of Basora is thus replete with tragic elements despite offering a happy ending. The ending of the play changes its predominantly somber mood. The resolution seems forced with an ethical order redressed and established by a superior force, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Nuruddin becomes the king of Basora. However, it remains a besetting question in the play whether Nuruddin is efficient enough to rule Basora given his romantic and illusion temperament, which caused his failure as a ruler before. The dramatist's way of restoring justice to Nuruddin remains questionable. Perhaps the dramatist sees him as the king, keeping in mind his process of self-transformation through suffering. Still, one might have misgivings about the qualifications of Nuruddin as a ruler. Visions of Basora articulates Sri Aurobindo's ideas on religion of humanity on two grounds. Firstly, it deals with the question of equality and feudal order. Secondly, in a related vein, it explores the idea of the state. The fundamental problem in the play stems from the problem of equality. While Ibn Sani, retaining a feudal mindset, endorses a view of equality, the other vizier, Al-Mu'min, indulges in discriminatory practices. Ibn's mindset aligns perfectly with the feudal order, but Al-Mu'min skews this design in his favor and keeps the laws of equality. In this context, Sri Aurobindo's ideas on equality sounds pertinent to quote. The claim to equality, like the thirst for liberty, is individualistic in its origin. It is not native or indispensable to the essence of the collectivist ideas. It is the individual who demands liberty for himself. The collectivist strength and the state idea have the rather opposite tendency. They are self-compelled to take up more and more the compulsory management and control of the mind, life, will, action of the community and the individual as part of it until personal liberty is pressed out of existence. But similarly, it is individual who demands himself equality with all others when a class demands. It is the individual multiplied, claiming for himself all who are of his grade, political, economic status, and equal place, privilege or opportunity with those who have or inherited a superiority of the status. The social reason conceded first the claim to liberty, but in practice it admitted uh, only so much equality before the law, are helpful but not to effective political equality of the board, as as was necessary to ensure reasonable freedom for all. So Sri Aurobindo's idea of equality depends on the individual liberty, the right of individual liberty to choose his people, to choose a collective notion. So this is where I guess Sri Aurobindo departs fundamentally from Shakespeare, where in Shakespearean ideas of kingship, Shakespearean ideas of human evolution, there is a collectivist notion of state which imposes its power on the individual, which restricts the growth of the individual, as we see in case of Macbeth or in Hamlet or in King Lear, that the idea of nation state is pitted against the idea of individual transgression, individual action, or in Dr. Foster as well in Marlowe's. But Sri Aurobindo focuses entirely on the inner realization of man as a power of as the girdle for transforming the system. The man becomes the area of fundamental importance in Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary schema. Harun's character, although not fleshed out properly by the dramatist, happens to be significant on several accounts in the play. Not only does it reinstate the Aurobindonian idea of a divine law and justice, but also it invokes the template of an ideal ruler. The unwavering faith in the ordinance of a superior divine faculty upholds Sri Aurobindo's vision on justice. There is a duality in the representation of the all merciful in the play. While it has a strong hand to administer justice, it also possesses the tenderness of a father to protect the virtuous and the ethical from the clutches of the evil forces. Harun al Rashid acts as a divine agent in the play to redress and restore the principles of dharma breached by the antagonist. The crime and punishment trope turns the play into a merely from a dramatic moral fable from a dramatic romance. This moral vision remains intrinsic to Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary ideals, spiritual ideals. Vizis of Basora, within its allegorical mold, articulates Sri Aurobindo's vision of state. Although the setting is in Syria, it reflects the problem of contemporary governance. The binaries of the good and evil, ethical and the political and the personal the play deals with, remain essential to Sri Aurobindo's concept of a divinely ordained state. In this regard, Aurobindo's ideas correspond to his philosophy on the evolution of man. It departs from the Western notion of the Hobbesian state and the reductionist reading of man. Aurobindo despises state egoism, which is brutal, rapacious, cunning, oppressive, intolerant of free action, free speech, opinion, even of freedom of conscience and religion. Sri Aurobindo's intellectual commerce between idealism of Kant, Fichte, and their transcendental ideas and the Vedic cosmology of presenting the human being as an agent of the divine plays an abiding role behind his ideas of the state. As a result, he espouses the notion of an action in which the human being
Shubham,
acts
I
as
would just, Shubham, sorry to interrupt you. I would just ask you to request you rather to wind up your presentation.
yes, I just need 3 4 minutes. It's
Yes,
almost
yes, sure, sure. That would be wonderful. Thank you, thank you.
as a result, he espouses the notion of an action in which the human being acts as an arbiter of divine justice, eradicating the evil and thereby ensuring the triumph of justice. Aurobindo's idea of a Jaina state perfectly aligns with the texture of the Villages of Basora. It is very ingenious to deploy Caliph Harun al-Rashid as an administrator of justice. Harun, being a legendary figure in the Arabian Nights, remains beyond the ethical paradigm of good and evil. The being of Harun gets driven by a spiritual idea of all pervasive justice, where the question of free will and agency geared towards the sustenance of good governance. As a result, while the play retains the mundane dualities of good and evil, Harun emerges as a superior force to resolve the crisis in favor of a morally sustainable climate of change. Harun's position in the play offers some light into the central paradox between the divinely ordained justice and individual freedom. I think it would not be relevant to comment the disease of Basora I think it's pertinent to think that this is the Basura lays down a socialist doctrine by conceptualizing the idea of war from an egalitarian point of view. This ensures equality, freedom, and justice. Also, it remains committed to the religious ethics of Islam. Dharma and karma, ethical consciousness and individual action get integrated thereby. The characters appears as in epistemological carriers of values and ideals. In other words, the characters in the play more act as an embodiment of different traits and consciousness instead of acting as characters of flesh and blood. The quest for idealism is perhaps the only reason behind the choice of Nuruddin as the king of Bazora. His illusory idealism juxtaposed with the ethical nobility illustrates his evolutionary reach towards a greater consciousness. Apart from this, Nuruddin has a functional role in ensuring the law of justice. One cannot but explore the influence he holds covertly in exposing the tyranny of Al-Mu'ene and King Al-Zaini to the Caliph Harun. He suffers immensely due to his prodigality, yet he remains committed to the ideals of justice. In this play, the Sri Aurobindo deals with an array of important questions like ethics, religion, and equality. Sri Aurobindo, although here he does not foreground physically fortified hero-like persons, this play seems to express Sri Aurobindo's views on two accounts. It expresses the necessity of faith and commitment to the ethical order. Also, it endorses the notion of an ideal state, which is accommodative, kind, and exclusionary. It departs from the Western notion of the repressive state apparatus and accords individual liberty its optimum value. It is quite obvious that Sri Aurobindo conceptualizes an inclusive model of the state to the spiritualization of a political idea. The spiritualization of the state, however, does not foreclose its link with the actual material conditions. Rather, through the spirit and the matter to come in close correspondence, rather, the spirit and the matter come in close correspondence in search of an aesthetically robust culture. His philosophy of state, thus departing from Western paradigms, showcases the outline of an inclusive welfare state, which is later developed by philosophers and political theorists like Marx and Nussbaum. Franz Fanon, in chapter 3, The Wretched of the Earth, The Wretched of the Earth, shows how the process of violent change in the social order entails the replication of the same structure, leading to dictatorship. As evident in the play of Sri Aurobindo, seeks for a king who can draw perfect harmony between his inner self and the outer self. Neither will he be under the complete sway of the biopolitical structure of the state, nor will he be totally ignorant of its modality. Instead, the ideal ruler will be the lover of humanity and is skillful in its administrative responsibilities at once. Taking cue from Ila Gandhi, we can argue that Sri Aurobindo's quest for a new ruler is imperative, to quote Gandhi, to imagine a new transformation of social consciousness which exceeds the reified identities and rigid boundaries, unquote, invoked by the colonial or the national consciousness of his time. It also shares close affinity with Nussbaum's capability approach, in which she dwells on two normative claims. First, the claim that the freedom to achieve a well-being of primary moral importance, and second, the freedom to achieve well-being is to be understood in terms of the people's capabilities, that is, their real opportunities to do of what they have the reason to value. The approach has been developed in a variety of ways, and this is important. This is how I wind up my paper. So this is how Sri Aurobindo's notion of an evolutionary being, an evolutionary state, shares close space, shares close affinities with the modern theories, with the modern ideas of the state, which also advocate the notion of humanitarian justice, keeping the individual capacity at the forefront. This is all about my argument today, and I hope I haven't taken much time. So I know I have already agreed with 1 hour. Still, thank you for giving me the chance for presenting my ideas in such great detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shubham. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation on the comparison of the ideas of kingship in Shakespeare and Sri Aurobindo. And we are very grateful to you for the care that you have taken to prepare a very, very exhaustive lecture comparing and contrasting many ideas that would, I'm sure, have benefited our listeners. We move over to our next speaker, who, of course, needs no introduction to English literary scholars worldwide. Professor Goutam Ghoshal is a PhD, a DLit in the Department of English, Vishwabharati Shantiniketan. Apart from Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, his areas of interest include 19th century British and American literature, post colonial literature, Shakespeare's poetry and characters, and of course, Rabindra Sangeet. Professor Ghoshal's books include Indian Responses to Shakespeare, Indian Literature Points of View, Thoughts on American Literature, Sri Aurobindo's Prose Style, Sri Aurobindo and World Literature, Rainbow Bridge, a comparative study of Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, and others. He is a co-editor of the first reprint of James Cousin's 1917 book, New Ways in English Literature, which came out recently with a long introduction to Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry, and which the book in fact initiated this idea of the study of Aurobindo's theory of poetry. Professor Ghoshal has lectured at various universities across the world. He has published two anthologies of poems entitled No High Romance and Magic Mirror and Other Poems. Most importantly, Professor Ghoshal has been a mentor of the Department of English, Karim City College, for several years now. We turn to him for advice, we turn to him for suggestions, we turn to him to share every joy and sorrow, academic and non-academic. And Professor Ghoshal is someone who just not only teaches, Sri Aurobindo, he practices Sri Aurobindo in life, and an understanding of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy would also be evident from an understanding of Professor Ghoshal's mind. So we are very grateful that we have his patronage all the time and that we can disturb him and invite him to talk to us and to our students. And with this, Professor Ghoshal, I would like you to begin your lecture on Sri Aurobindo's views on Shakespeare's Cleopatra. Over to you, Professor Ghoshal.
Good morning, everybody. And in fact, I'm grateful to you for inviting me to speak. The immediate purpose was, of course, to in a kind of promote my favorite student, to have his say here. And I will speak first in general, briefly, then I will come to Sri Aurobindo's comments on Cleopatra. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, perfectly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Perfectly.
Perfectly.
So just, I think Shubham has already clarified that Sri Aurobindo is not a monk, and Sri Aurobindo did not leave the world, contrary to the popular belief. And I won't go to the aspect of nationalism. You can have see my lecture on his nationalism in the YouTube, where I have deconstructed Dipesh Chakraborty, Sumit Mitra, and others. And because it's a misconception that he was a kind of extremist. It's wrong. And but that is a different part. Today I will focus on his views on Shakespeare. In fact, apart from other things which people do not know about Sri Aurobindo, he is the only Indian critic who has a whole body of aesthetics on Shakespeare. Because we have great critics like Subodh Chandra Sengupta, to name the first. We have K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, another great critic. And then our teacher, Jyoti Bhattacharya, who couldn't speak much, a Marxist critic, but I think he was excellent. Then Sadhan Ghosh was there from Kolkata Presidency College. And of course, some others later who wrote some critical books on Shakespeare. But what I mean by a whole body of aesthetics is related to Sri Aurobindo's own philosophy linked with Shakespeare's. Now, Sri Aurobindo was asked to classify and rank the greatest poets of the world, and by Setna, his Parsi disciple, and Sri Aurobindo was reluctant. He was always refusing to give his views because he was also a politician till the end of his life. He was not willing to commit. But Setna was insistent. And so Sri Aurobindo chooses 11 poets for the utter first class. And in the very first row, you have first Homer, then Vasha, then Valmiki, and then surprisingly Shakespeare. So after three epic poets, here comes a dramatic poet. Now, this was a surprise because Shakespeare was not at all a mystic also. And then in the second row, he had Sophocles, Euripides, Dante, Milton, others. And in the final row, Goethe stands in solitary grandeur. So about that aesthetics, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Perfectly, sir.
So it is, in fact, it should be a vast study because Sri Aurobindo speaks very briefly sometimes. He was a fast writer. He was a very quick writer. But at the same time, he was very accurate. If there were sleeps only in the articles because he did not have time to revise, and many things he dictated in his later life because his hands were not doing good. It was shaking and he had to dictate. And so he, first in the future poetry, where he was revising, he was writing a revised history of English poetry. There he takes up Shakespeare for the first time and tells us that he is both, he is not Virat, but he is Hiranyagarbha. Hiranyagarbha is a phrase from the Upanishads, and it refers to Shakespearean soliloquies. He says he is a poet of the luminous interiors of man. And it is interesting because two supreme lords of the English language are here in a dialogue. And Sri Aurobindo says he is Hiranyagarbha, he knows basically the insides and the soliloquies. And Shakespeare knows he presents the outer life, but he knows the inner of the outer. Not just the outer, but the inner of the outer. Why does Cordelia say this? Why does Lear say this? He gives us, that is why, because he is a great yoga psychologist. You have to keep Sri Aurobindo's, to work on Sri Aurobindo and Shakespeare, you have to refer to Sri Aurobindo's psychology. Now, Sri Aurobindo says also in the future poetry that he does not speak life, but life speaks it out through him through many mouths and many moods. He does not speak life, but life speaks it out through many mouths and many moods. So it was very unusual in the history of Earth that a playwright can stand behind every character on the stage separately. And Sri Aurobindo has an interesting sentence. He says, he veils behind his characters. So uh, he veils himself behind his characters. And he says he is a great creator, not an artist, and differentiates between the style of Marlowe and Shakespeare very clearly. And he is the first, he's the beginner of author-centric criticism of Christopher Marlowe, much before, 10 years before, Una Ellis Farmer came out with Jacobean drama, where Ellis Farmer was the first to claim that Marlowe is an author-centric playwright. And later, earlier Sri Aurobindo had said Marlowe is not a dramatic genius. His genius is basically lyrical. And like this, Shakespeare, Sri Aurobindo takes up things and very quickly passes on because he had no time. He was doing other things. So a great philosopher from America, his name was Raymond Frank Piper. And in his book called The Hungry Eye, he says, I have never seen an author who can compact so much of truth into one single sentence. So we have to see his passing comments on Cleopatra, which deconstructs many old views of Cleopatra as a high-class courtesan, a Rekha Ganeshan. Not exactly. He was something more. She was something more. And so the point was, in that letter to Setna, he was discussing the difference between nobility and force. And Setna was confusing nobility with force. So Aurobindo says nobility is a different thing. It relates to epic. And it is like Marlowe is the most forceful of the Elizabethan writers, but nobility is something different. And then suddenly he comes to Cleopatra's, one of the final speeches of Cleopatra in Act 5, final scene, where Cleopatra is committing suicide with the asps. And he quotes those lines. I'm quoting the lines once again for your memory to remind you. If thou and nature can so greatly part, the stroke of death is as lover's pinch, which hearts and is desired. Now this is almost all the critics have highlighted. It is, the sexual connotation is there. But there is an excessive stress on the sexual aspect of this. The stroke of death is a lover's pinch, which hearts and is desired. Then Sri Aurobindo continues the whole. Now, for your information, Sri Aurobindo threw away all the books in the last maybe 30, 40 years of his life. He only kept Shakespeare. And there is a very intimate link between Shakespeare and Sri Aurobindo. Because what Shakespeare states as a problem, Sri Aurobindo answers that, well, this is the solution to your problem. So they can be paired. And I have claimed also that at many places for the last 10 years, I have been claiming that there is no greater event of Shakespeare in the language. Because both of them have done anything with the language. In fact, the English language obeyed them. So then Cleopatra says, come then, mortal witch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. And Sri Aurobindo says that Shakespeare is not a master of the epic. Sri Aurobindo is not good at portraying nobility. because he is basically speaking of the common man. Please switch off your mic.
Sir, you're muted.
Gautam
Sir,
sir, you
you're
have to
muted.
also unmute.
Sir,
Every
please
participant was
unmute.
muted, so I request you to also unmute. Gautam sir.
Sir, you're muted.
Gautam sir, your mic is muted. Please unmute your mic.
Is it okay?
Yes, yes, sir. Fine.
Could you miss everything?
No, no,
Did,
no, sir. Just it was muted for all. No, it's okay, sir. You can go ahead.
okay. I thought you missed all the stuff I spoke.
No, sir. No, sir.
No,
No, sir. Please go ahead, sir.
you just got muted for a minute. You got muted
Okay,
for a
okay.
minute.
That's very comforting. So and as Raymond Frank Piper has said that he could compact. I have never seen an author who could compact so much of truth into one single sentence. I will just read out that small part which he speaks on Cleopatra in his letters to say it in a very small part, and you will see the command of her language and the exact expression of what he wants to mean by nobility, which he finds in Cleopatra's last speech, a very unusual also because Shakespeare is not good at poeticizing greatness, Sri Aurobindo says, because he is dealing with other things of the samsara in Sanskrit. He is dealing with the common things of life, and greatness he does not portray much. But here is a sudden, Sri Aurobindo was a supreme detective of language, and Shakespeare was his favorite. Now, see, I'm just reading out those small part. Sri Aurobindo says people thinks Shakespeare was, as I've said, the usual concept of most of the critics. Of course, somebody has spoken of the royal queen embracing death, but they couldn't go very deep into the fact that Cleopatra was a multiple being and she had other greatnesses. Sri Aurobindo was the first to tell us that she had other greatnesses. She was not just an integral, and she was not just an enchantress. She had other great qualities. Let me read out. For she was a remarkable woman, a great queen, a skillful ruler and politician, not merely the erotic intriguer people make of her. Shakespeare is not good at describing greatness. He poeticized the homme moyen, the ordinary man of the street. But he has caught something here. Something of the epic, something of the nobility is caught here suddenly in this line. In fact, there are many passages in the Antony and Cleopatra which verges on the epic, which Sri Aurobindo hasn't told me, but I have found it. The whole passage stands on a par with Antony's dying speech, which I, of course, remember. I don't have to read it out because it is so great. And in Kenneth Muir's edition, Kenneth Muir says that the speech is repeated twice, and he says the next speech is an editorial fault. And the speech is, I am dying, Egypt, dying, for only I hear importune death awhile, until of many thousand kisses the poor last I lay upon thy lips. And that is wonderful. Sri Aurobindo has put four vertical strokes by the lines. I am dying, Egypt, dying. Only I hear importune death awhile. as you, you might remember the last scene of Muqaddar Ke Sikandar, where as if Sikandar is waiting for his beloved to come, and he is holding his breath for the last time. There are many Shakespearean moments in Muqaddar Ke Sikandar, and especially Hamlet and Antony and Cleopatra. And maybe Manmohan Desai was the director of the film. Now, I'm dying, Egypt dying, only I hear importune death a while. I ask death to wait a bit, until of many thousand kisses the poor last I lay upon thy lips. And this is not a sensual kiss, which they have done in the past. And if you go back to the first scenes of the play, when Cleopatra is speaking of new heaven and new earth, Antony is also speaking of new heaven and new earth to be created. It is still a blank prescience. They don't know much about it, but there is a blank prescience of it that it is to come. And that can be related with this final speech of nobility. And Sri Aurobindo says it is not a yogic nobility, but the nobility of poetry. It is the nobility in poetry. What is that which Sri Aurobindo finds in this passage? Calm, self-mastery, beautiful, but poetic, not a yogic control. So this is what Matthew Arnold calls nobility, because he is an advocate of restraint. And when you are restrained, you are noble sometimes. This is a passage where it happens. And also, Sri Aurobindo has given examples in other letters, like the Thane of Fife had a wife, where is she now? Now, Cleopatra, this is an entire integral view of Cleopatra. We know of one side of Cleopatra, that she is an enchantress, she matures, well, she has an elevation, she has a kind of refinement, even through her sexual consciousness, because always in her images, the sexual images come back again and again. But Sri Aurobindo does not highlight on them. He speaks on the integral character of the queen, who is a queen, a politician, a ruler, a manipulator of events. So this is an integral view of the queen. And about Sri Aurobindo's predecessors as a critic in his line, I think we should read Bradley and Wilson Knight carefully, because they are the most intuitive of all the critics of Shakespeare, the old ones. And you will see that much of the language of Wilson Knight, it comes very close to Sri Aurobindo's way of exposition language, the expository technique, Wilson Knight. And what is Sri Aurobindo is Wilson Knight more mature. Wilson Knight was, in fact, a fan of Sri Aurobindo. He told Srinivas Iyengar that, well, he is beyond compare. So, and Dorothy Richardson, of course, they were fascinated by Sri Aurobindo because of this integral character. He just took one speech of Cleopatra, and he could speak of the entire queen, who is not just a person who loves, who is much into sex, who is much into sensualities, who is much into the pleasures of life, the lower pleasures of life. At the same time, she is a queen, she is a ruler, she is a politician of exceptional quality. Now, this integral view is missing in the previous criticism of Cleopatra, and Sri Aurobindo does it in a few lines. Now, this is not all about Sri Aurobindo and Shakespeare. It's a vast field. Sri Aurobindo has spoken of Richard III, on Measure for Measure, on Macbeth, on Hamlet, detailed discussions, comparisons with Kalidasa, and the difference between the society of the Elizabethan age and the society of the age of Kalidasa. So it's a vast field. But I took here just 4 or 5 lines, his comments on Cleopatra, to show that, see, here he is an integral critic. And as Shubham has said, that he is not just a poet. And it is, Busudhara has said that he is controversial. The controversy is relating to his poetry. The controversy is related to his nationalism. But there can be no controversy regarding his criticism. There he is a supreme lord. And we have to explore, because he has, as Reverend Frank Piper has said, in one sentence he compacts the whole. So we have to now expand what he had to say about Marlowe, about Shakespeare, about Keats, about Whitman, about Yeats, about the Irish poets. So this is, this I found that his comments on Cleopatra, his brief comments on Cleopatra, which come with reference to nobility, with a debate relating to nobility and force. He totally enlightens the character of Cleopatra in a flash. But it needs clarification, and one has to know what Sri Aurobindo is. But people has rejected him as a monk. He escaped, he flew away from Kolkata, and he lived in isolation. His life began after 1926, when he went into total seclusion. So that's all. If you have questions, I will answer.
Thank you, sir. It was really a very informative session. Uh, we are running a bit short of time, but still, there is a question from a student, sir. She's asking, as a beginner, what can she read of Sri Aurobindo?
She must start with the letters. And I suggest the letters on yoga, not the letters on literature, art, poetry. Because I always suggest the letters on yoga, because Sri Aurobindo's psychology is there. His entire psychological theory of the subliminal, which he differentiates from the Western subliminal, because the West confuses the subliminal with the subconscious. Sri Aurobindo deconstructs and says that the subliminal is behind and the subconscious is below. And so if you start with the letters and also the language of the letters, it is an invitation to enter into the bigger world of Sri Aurobindo. If you start with the life divine, you are gone, because you will be discouraged. You have to get into the vibration through the letters. Then after the letters on yoga, you turn to the letters of literature, art, poetry. And finally, the major texts, the life divine, the human cycle, the synthesis of yoga, the ideal of human unity, which is a major text in the context of the present situation. The ideal of human unity, war and self-determination, how war will end, and then the human cycle, which is a large thesis on the evolution of human society.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon, sir. Sir, where do we find these lectures on yoga? Is it available on the net?
It is open in the net, even not in the PDF. They are plain. You can find, if you type it, they will come. You type basis of yoga and it will come. You type
Okay,
Sri
sir, thank
Aurobindo on
you.
yoga. it will come in Word file.
Okay, thank you, sir. Interestingly, there is a question I'll be putting up to Shubham Datta, sir. That was from you, sir, when he was giving his deliberation. And you asked that what is your idea of Nuruddin as the hero and uh, Anis as the heroine? Yes.
Yeah.
Shubham, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. So, sir, will you please repeat the question? Will you please repeat the question?
What is your idea of the hero Nuruddin and the heroine Anis?
Okay. So in the play, Viziers of Basora, Sri Aurobindo shows Nuruddin to be the absolute ruler, the ideal ruler, because Nuruddin becomes a hero at the end of the play because he goes through a lot of sufferings. Sri Aurobindo in his personal life also goes through a lot of sufferings. So he ultimately he is the ruler. He is considered to be the ruler or the king of Basora because of his suffering. In Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, suffering leads to the salvation of man. Suffering leads to the redemption of man. And this is the Basora. We see the articulation of the same policy, same philosophy that Nuruddin, who combines the ethical nobility and the aesthetic idealism, and also goes through a lot of suffering. He suffers a lot. His state exchequer runs into wretchedness, and because of the suffering, he is eventually appointed as the king because he has that psychic being, he has that psychic consciousness within his mind. Maybe he is a profligate, maybe he is a prodigal son of Al-Mu'min, but still, what remains intrinsic to Nuruddin is his idea of the psychic being, that the realization of which remains central to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, and that's why he is considered to be the hero. And also Anis, Anis al-Jaisi, the heroine of the play, also shows her psychic characteristics that despite being a slave girl, despite being purchased from the harem, she invariably falls in love with Nuruddin. So Sri Aurobindo talks about how the two or the identical consciousness come together. And in Annie's characterization, Annie's representation, we find that Annie falls in love with Nuruddin because she finds an answering soul to her consciousness in Nuruddin. And despite their sufferings, despite their problems, despite the problems of the state, eventually they go on to become they go on becoming the kings and the queens of the state. And this is how Sri Aurobindo conceptualizes the idea of a good ruler, of an ideal ruler who has the presence of the psychic being within their mind, who has the idea of realizing the psychic being when it's needed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any participant who is having any question can unmute and ask. Okay, the session was really very informative. Now I would like to call our senior most faculty member of the department of English department of Karim City College, Professor A.K. Das sir, for the vote of thanks. Das sir.
Am I audible to you?
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir.
Good afternoon, all. It was really a very rewarding session to hear two important speakers, Assistant Professor Shubham Datta of Gokhale Memorial Girls College, Kolkata, and Goutam Ghosal, Sir, Professor, Department of English, Vishwabharati University, Santiniketan. Both of them have spoken on Aurobindo and tried to compare Aurobindo's views with Shakespeare and also contrast wherever it is there. And this has been a new light thrown on our students who might not have been aware of all these things. And it has gone a long way in rewarding their experience on the subject. We are so much thankful to Shubham Dutta sir for his brilliant speech and insightful ideas about where Shakespeare differed from Aurobindo or Aurobindo differed from Shakespeare, and where there were unanimity of ideas between the two. We are extremely thankful to Goutam Ghosal sir for his such a wonderful speech within a short span of time, which was so brilliantly spoken and so captivating on us that it is going to remain in our mind for a lifetime. Thank you all, both the professors, and I thank our students, faculty members of our college and other colleges, and students of other colleges too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Gautam sir. Thank you, Shubham sir. We have posted the feedback link for the feedback form in the chat box. You can go ahead. Yes, Shubham sir, you were saying something.
I just said thank you to the current City College for this grand opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, sir. It is our pleasure to have you here.
So I have a question, sir. So where can we get the link for the further like seminars that are being held here?
You can follow us on our Facebook page. I'm posting the link. You can follow us there. You'll get all the links and all the informations regarding our deliberations.
A
Wow.
very warm note of gratitude from the Department of English to our wonderful speakers, to our wonderful listeners who together made this session a very, very interesting and memorable session for all. Thank you, and we sign off for the day. The lecture